Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're breaking down one of the most incredible, most jaw dropping economic transformations in modern history. We're talking about China's rise from really widespread poverty to becoming a global superpower. And they did it in just 40 years. So, that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did one of the world's poorest countries become a global superpower in just 40 years? I mean, how does a nation transform itself so completely and so quickly? To really get it, we've got to go back to where this whole story started. All right, to really grasp the sheer scale of this change, you have to start right here. In the late 1970s, a staggering 90% of China's population lived in extreme poverty. And look, that's not just some abstract statistic. For hundreds of millions of people, this was their reality. It meant barely getting by on subsistence farming, with the recent absolutely terrifying memory of widespread famine hanging over them. Okay, now, fast forward 40 years. That number, it's plummeted to less than 1%. Let that sink in. This is without a doubt one of the most staggering reversals of fortune in all of human history. And this massive drop in poverty, well, it was fueled by an absolute economic explosion. Just look at this. China's share of the global economy went from a tiny 2% back in 1978 to over 18% today. That's what made it the world's second largest economy. So the question remains, how on earth did they pull this off? Let's get into it. All right, our story really kicks off back in 1949. After a brutal, long civil war, Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China. Now, his vision for the country, it was built on a really radical, absolute communist ideology. And his first major experiment, well, it was going to reshape the country, but with truly disastrous consequences. So in 1958, Mao launches something called the Great Leap Forward. The goal was to supercharge industrialization, like overnight. The plan had two main parts. First, collectivize all the farms, meaning the government owned all the land. And second, get this, ordering everyday citizens to build small steel furnaces right in their own backyards. The result? It was a total, unmitigated catastrophe. I mean, those backyard furnaces, they produced completely useless, low-quality metal, and even worse, they pulled farmers away from the fields. At the same time, with the farms collectivized, there was zero incentive for anyone to work harder or produce more, so food output just plummeted. The Great Leap Forward led directly to the Great Famine, one of the deadliest in human history, killing an estimated 20 to 40 million people. Now, after a failure that immense, you'd think he'd face some serious criticism, right? He did. But instead of backing down, Mao doubled down. He launched the Cultural Revolution to completely purge any and all opposition. He basically unleashed these student-led militias, the Red Guards, who went after anyone they thought was a traitor to his ideology. It was chaos, and it plunged the country into another full decade of turmoil. But here's where the story gets a little more complicated. For all that chaos and destruction, Mao's era wasn't just about that. His government also surprisingly laid some really crucial groundwork for the future. A nationwide public education system was put in place. Huge literacy campaigns were launched, and the number of schools actually tripled. This created a much more educated population than China had ever had before. And Mao's famous declaration that women hold up half the sky, well, it was actually backed by some real policy changes. For example, a 1950 law made forced marriages illegal and gave women new rights, like the right to divorce. In a deeply traditional society, this was a huge social advancement. So when Mao died in 1976, China was at a major crossroads. The leader who eventually came out on top, Deng Xiaoping, had a philosophy that was the polar opposite of Mao's rigid, top-down ideology. And it was his pragmatism that would set the stage for the incredible transformation to come. Okay, so let's take a look at how this man, Deng Xiaoping, and get this, he was actually purged from the party twice by Mao for his practical views, how he became the unlikely architect of modern China's economic miracle. See, Deng's approach wasn't about some grand, sweeping, ideological plan. Not at all. It was perfectly summed up by this saying he had, crossing the river by feeling the stones. Basically, it meant taking slow, practical, tested steps. You take one step, you see if the stone holds, and then you adjust your path. No giant leaps into the unknown. So, what did this feeling the stones approach actually look like in the real world? Well, Deng's reforms targeted 4 key areas:
and they systematically unlocked the country's potential, really from the ground up.
First up, agriculture. Okay, so the state technically still owned all the land, but farmers could now lease it. And here's the crucial part. They could sell any surplus crops they grew, anything beyond their government quota, for their own personal profit. Bam. For the first time in decades, farmers had a real direct incentive to work harder, to innovate, and to produce more.
Okay, second, with agriculture getting way more efficient, you suddenly had millions of rural workers who needed jobs. So what was Deng's answer? Something called Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs. Think of them as small, locally run businesses that sparked this huge industrial boom outside the big cities. By the 90s, these TVEs had created over 100 million jobs and were pumping out a fifth of China's entire industrial output. Just incredible.
Third, Deng put an end to decades of China's isolation from the rest of the world. He was smart. He knew China desperately needed foreign money and technology to catch up, so he created what he called an open door policy to attract investment from all over the globe. And the key to making this open door work? Special Economic Zones, or SEZs. The best way to think about them is like little laboratories for capitalism, set up right on China's coast. These zones offered huge tax breaks and way less red tape, basically acting like giant magnets for global companies who were looking for a cheap place to build their factories. And the results were, well, they were explosive. Just take Shenzhen, which was China's very first SEZ. Back in 1980, it was basically just a small fishing village with a GDP of around $300 million. Fast forward 40 years, it's a global tech metropolis with a GDP of over $400 billion. Yeah, the zones work. And finally, the fourth crucial reform, investing in people. Because look, to power all these new factories and businesses, China needed a skilled workforce. So, a 1986 law made 9 years of education mandatory for everyone. The government poured money into schools, focusing especially on technical and vocational training. The literacy rate just soared from about 65% to over 95%. This created the human capital the skilled workers needed to keep that economic boom going. So when you add all of these reforms together, the economic results were, well, they were undeniable, truly historic. But, and this is a big but, this rapid, breathtaking development came at a really significant and very complicated cost. To really put this transformation into perspective, just look at this comparison with India. In 1990, believe it or not, the average person in India was actually wealthier than the average person in China. But just 30 years later, after all that explosive growth, China's GDP per capita was nearly 3 times larger. The economic miracle was, in that sense, complete. But, and this is the cost we were talking about, this economic opening was never, ever matched by a political one. When huge pro-democracy protests erupted in Tiananmen Square in 1989, Deng's government responded with a brutal, violent crackdown. The decades of growth also created severe environmental damage. And through it all, the Communist Party's authoritarian grip on power, it never loosened. And this leaves us with the central tension of China's entire story. It's a question that really defines its present and will, without a doubt, shape its future. An economic miracle was absolutely achieved. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. But what is the price of progress when it comes without freedom? That's really the question at the heart of this 40-year miracle.